Well, 2009, 2010, I realized that Twitter and social media had completely changed the scenario for the future of media. So it meant, in a bad way, sort of traditional sources and quality journalism was under threat. But in a good way, it was also creating a much more democratic media system where ordinary people had a lot more power over creation of content, consumption of content. And in all of that, I saw an opportunity for business. So my first startup was Storyful. That was the first social news agency. And we went out and found people with remarkable images and stories to tell, and we verified them. We fought back against the beginnings of what we now know as disinformation. So that was very successful. We sold the company. I worked for Twitter, where I started to learn a lot more about the problems that social media was bringing down the pipe in terms of disinformation and what has become now known as the infodemic. So essentially, the viral spread of lies and conspiracy theories that have damaging real world impact on things like, for example, reducing the uptake on vaccination programs or inciting violence, like we saw Grafton Street in Dublin recently and Capitol Hill on January 6th. And so what Kinsen essentially was set up to do was give people confidence in what they see in their news feeds, quality journalism, quality news information. So about a year and a half ago, we pivoted the company Kinsen, and now the mission is more exactly to help people who are protecting online communities and conversations from disinformation. The first root cause of this infodemic is volume of information. There's now, 500 hours of video loaded on YouTube every single minute. There are 17,000 new podcasts put up on podcast platform every week. There's just an overwhelming abundance of content in 6,500 different active languages around the world. So we just can't handle the overabundance of information that's out there because everybody now can tell a story. So finding the story that's true is really difficult. The second problem is that these big content platforms are driven by algorithms. And because their motive is commercial gain and advertising, those algorithms are primed to create outrage and emotion. They're not there to sort quality from low quality. And that's the other big problem. So the bigger problem of, let's call it the infodemic, which is the viral spread, a bit like a virus where, a group of people are sitting in a room together, a super spreader comes in and spreads the virus. This is happening in conversations around things as ridiculous as like yoga. You will get someone coming in, a super spreader, saying, hey, all you people are really skeptical of, big pharmacology and big government. Well, actually, do you know that? And then the conspiracy theory starts. And that's how the virus works. A distinction we make between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is people getting things wrong on the internet. It's, your crazy Uncle Frank sends you a video that he's picked up, or someone tells you some urban myth or legend, and it's just too good to be true. And they share it with you, and it turns out to be too good to be true. That's misinformation. There's no malice, no real organization behind it. It just happens. Disinformation is where organized campaigns of groups and sometimes networks are purposely promoting false information as part of some broader political or commercial agenda. Now, that could be governments, and we've seen this with the Russian state-backed disinformation campaigns in the US. It can be corporations. We're seeing evidence that corporations are paying for misinformation to be spread. And then it can be loose networks of people that are tied together by conspiracies or political belief. So that could include neo-Nazis and race hate groups, or it could involve people like the QAnon movement in the United States, which was affiliated broadly with Donald Trump, but had its own organization online, much more decentralized. So it's kind of hard sometimes. I see people always saying like the far right are the ones who are doing most of the disinformation. That may be right today, but far left groups or other people who don't have a political affiliation also turn up in these networks. So disinformation has become like a connective tissue, allowing all these different groups, whether they're governments or corporations or just loose networks, to promote a political gain or end. Could be getting people on the streets for protest. It could be reducing people's faith in vaccines. So that's what disinformation for me is important. And the reason that distinction is so important is because we need to stop restricting people's freedom of speech. And that's the big danger. We could create regulation that told platforms to take down all the disinformation. But in the process, it could have a massive damage to freedom of speech and the ability to people say things. And therefore, we make sure that we focus on disinformation, and we're not really there to stop people saying crazy things in the internet. We're just there to stop the super spreaders. But very few people get drawn down the rabbit hole through the trapdoors, but they're the people we got to worry about. So, for example, last year, you'll see people who, for example, love New Age medicine and homeopathy, and they always want like the natural thing, or they're doing yoga and they're going sea swimming, and they're skeptical of different health risks, and they don't eat meat and whatever. Now, those people are primed for conspiracy theorists who will come in and say, hey, you know the way you don't eat chicken anymore because of genetically modified whatever? Did you know that they're injecting a virus into you every time they give you a vaccine? And something that's like, so what they're doing is they're seeing people who, for some reason, generally an emotional disconnect, some form of existing alienation. Sometimes it could be economic, but more importantly, it's kind of sometimes loneliness. And what these campaigns do is they prey on people that show a predisposition to be skeptical of establishments, to be disconnected from the political discourse, to be angry about something in their life. And they basically create communities which feel loving and warm. So suddenly what happens is you get these groups like QAnon that invite people in, they find them, they prey on their skepticism, their fear, sometimes prey on their need to be part of a group. And then before you know it, these people have gone down the rabbit hole. Now, when you go to someone like that, a friend, a neighbor, and tell them they're wrong, that reinforces their commitment to the disinformation community. And that's really where we have the biggest danger. People suddenly define themselves by their belief in a conspiracy theory, and anyone trying to persuade them otherwise is part of the conspiracy theory. So that's the problem. It's that small group of people who may have lost their job or be skeptical about something. They're the ones most vulnerable to this form of disinformation, and they're the ones who end up turning up in Capitol Hill or telling their neighbors not to take the vaccine, or promoting crazy theories that lead people to do crazy things like support far right groups in elections. So that's where I worry, and that's where we need to be very focused. We've got to basically give people critical thinking skills. So in the same way that people are concerned, let's say, about their health or the food they consume or their sleep patterns, we've all become much more attuned to understanding what we eat and how we exercise and mental health. And so we've learned over the years, in the last 10, 15, 20 years particularly, things like mindfulness. We've learned about the real dangers of eating too much of any particular food group. We've learned the dangers of meat. We know about the environmental impact of different things that we do, from driving a car to flying in a plane. We need the same level of critical thinking for information as we do for sleep, food, and various other aspects of our lives. And that's, I think, where media literacy as a phrase, it doesn't quite get what we need, which is to teach people from the very earliest age to have a series of very quick, what they call heuristics, like just mental models and rules by which they read something. So the way people read advertising, they don't absolutely believe everything they see in the advert. They've got certain things, telltale marks, and this is where regulation can play a really good role. So my dream is every time you walk into a social news feed, a bit like when you go into a supermarket, you can pick up an object and say, how much fat and sugar, carbs are in this food? And you're like, oh, no, that's too much. And similarly with information, when I see a piece of information on Twitter, I should be able to go into a label and say, this is from a quality source. This is not from a quality source. This is a government account. This has been fact checked by organizations to say it's wrong, or it's right, or it's in the middle. This has changed. This is manufactured. So, like all of the data that we could put into a piece of content that could act like a food label does for information. So there are two steps, I think. First is teaching people to be critical thinkers and media literate in this new age of media literacy. Two, getting a regulation that makes people see the transparency behind the information in their news feeds on social platforms. And three, algorithmic accountability. So we need to make the big platforms accountable for every time that their algorithm picks a piece of fringe information and recommends it to a big group, because that's where the super spreader events happen. So these for me are the three ways we start to flatten the curve. Obviously, in the long term, we've got to just get people up to speed with the way this all works. Number two, we've got to give them the ability to see what's in that information, maybe set their own preferences. So, you and me might be okay with seeing a lot of, like, you know, controversial opinions. Somebody else wants to turn them off. So we should have a lot more of those levers in a social platform to tailor what we're seeing to our appetite for controversy or for critical thinking, you know? So a good way of thinking about this is there's a phrase, a great researcher called Rene DeResta, who works for the Stanford Internet Observatory. She always talks about, we have got to stop people from assuming they have a freedom of reach while protecting freedom of speech. And what she means by that is, nobody has the right to have an algorithm take their tweet and send it to 10 million people, but they may have the right to say something absolutely crazy and maybe even disinformed. As long as it's not promoted into wider conversations, as long as it's not super spreader event, then I think people should be able to say whatever they want